Part 4 of Deconstructing Common Life by O.G. Rose, starting with Section 8. Kempt Smith on Hume claimed that the point of Hume's apparent skepticism was only to show that we ought to reject the request for showing that natural beliefs are justified. Regardless, we hold them anyway, and the proper philosophical task is to account for why we do. The PD, or postmodern deconstructionists, PD for short, would agree that it is meaningless to request justification for natural beliefs and concur that rather there is justification or not, we do indeed hold our beliefs. But it would seem for the PD that generally this means we shouldn't hold these beliefs, while for Hume the fact we hold beliefs without rational justification was reason for rationality to reverently respect the beliefs. For it is likely that there is a reason why the beliefs are held, even if that reason cannot be rendered into intelligibility. While the philosophical task of Hume is to prove our natural beliefs should be respected, the philosophical task of the PD seems to be to show that our natural beliefs should be deconstructed and replaced with beliefs that are more diverse, empathetic, and just. Hume might have warned that the dream to increase justice can be the dream that increases injustice, as is especially likely if common life isn't respected. In response, the PD might argue it's a risk worth taking to help those disadvantaged, a disagreement that Philip Rieff traced out in his work and that is expanded on in Belonging Again. Similar to Kurt Gödel, Hume was a metaskeptic in describing the natural operations of the human mind to account for why we make judgments which are unreasonable by the empiricist principle. Hume discovered that the mind's essential nature is such that we must make such unreasonable judgments. As Gödel showed, mathematics cannot ground itself, and yet we must continue to use mathematics. Hume discovered that the human is essentially incoherent, that humanity is of such a nature that even after discovering that it has no perception of any connection between a cause and its effect, and that there cannot be any such connection, it continues to suppose that there is such a connection. While Gödel believed his conclusions supported Platonic mathematics, Hume believed his conclusions necessitated space for natural beliefs, for Hume was a naturalist. PD thinkers agree that humans are essentially incoherent and agree with Hume in the impossibility of autonomous rationality. Both the Humean skeptic and PD understand that there is always space to ask the question, why? And that the why question always leads from one to another in eternal regression, because rationality cannot be its own grounding, and ultimately in endless chains of whys can only be broken with experience. Arguably, small children seem to understand what adults do not grasp. To illustrate the point, if someone from the outside asks an individual why he or she lives the way the individual does, no matter how well the person answers, the outsider can always ask why. The individual can answer every question well, but eventually the individual facing the outsider's questions will only be able to reply, "Come and see." But if the outsider says that he or she does not yet have reason to come and see, for the insider has not answered all the questions yet, and thus the insider's way of life has not been proven fully justified and worth the time to explore, what can the insider say? Nothing. What the outsider feels rationally justified to request is that which cannot be rationally provided. The final justification must be an experience, which the outsider will not take the time to have before the final justification is provided. An impossibility. If the outsider does not just get that the final justification must be an experience, and perhaps unknowingly ascribes to autonomous rationality, this experience will always fall outside accessibility. Worse yet, as a result, outsiders will believe they are rational and intelligent to cut themselves off from experiencing the life of the insider. Facing the impossibility of autonomous rationality, PD are more likely than Humean skeptics to use this truth as evidence for a need for political action or social reconfiguration by the collective to correct what has been created by the essential incomplete individuals. Humean skeptics, on the other hand, believe the incompleteness of rationality means we have no choice but to wait for common life to carry out its own slow evolution, which the PD thinker would note leaves those who suffer injustice alone to keep suffering. Generally, PD believes that the fact individuals are essentially incoherent means common life will rarely evolve unless an outside collective lends a direct hand. This isn't to say PD supports all collective action, but it is to say that PD thinkers are much more likely to support collective action than a Humean skeptic. When collective action fails, the PD is likely to return to the drawing board to think up a different collective action, while the Humean skeptic would take this failure as evidence that collective action necessarily fails at fixing common life, for only common life can fix itself. Hume's philosophy is meant to be essentially descriptive. Since it is impossible to ultimately justify rationality in natural beliefs, at best what can be done is argue why autonomous rationality is incomplete and then show how humans continue to live as if autonomous rationality was possible. Also, what ultimately grounds a rationality is not something that can be explained, only experienced. And so Hume hoped to describe how systems ultimately fall back on something which cannot be translated into rational terms. PD would agree that ultimately behind a given worldview are certain experiences of the world that cannot be rationalized, and thus PD emphasizes the need for discussing personal experiences in politics, philosophy, and the like. The patron saint of deconstruction, Jacques Derrida, rightly determined that systems are internally consistent only because of unrational premises that cannot be justified within the systems, and thus the systems, on grounds of being autonomously rational, must deconstruct themselves even if they are ultimately true. Derrida believed in regards to symbols, words, and the like that the sign's failure was structurally determined, and for him the same logic applied to all philosophical and ideological systems in general. There is no point within a system that will complete the system. Incompleteness is structurally determined, as knowledge is always in a state of being constituted and never arrives at a state of final constitution. So systems are always in a state of being constituted, and so are never constituted in of themselves. There will always be certain propositions generated within a system of discourse which render them inconsistent or incomplete, thereby undermining their claim to offer a comprehensive and satisfactory account of phenomena. Hume and Derrida can be found on the same wavelength. Derrida's thought was very similar to what Hume figured out, but I think with a key difference. Hume would have hesitated to say that a system deconstructs itself because it ultimately isn't rational all the way down. Rather, he would have said that all systems, even deconstruction, rely on unrational premises, and so to criticize them on these grounds is simply to criticize systems for being what they are. It would be akin to criticizing a human for being unable to fly. I don't believe Hume would have liked saying that systems deconstruct because they prove incomplete, meaning they cannot utterly ground themselves rationally, for I think he would fear this suggested the possibility of a system that didn't deconstruct and thus wasn't incomplete, which would suggest autonomous rationality should be possible. Hume might have feared that the term deconstruction suggested rationality was always a force of oppression, incoherence, and privilege preservation. Hume may have found the language of deconstruction too suggestive of nihilism and too prone to imply philosophy was useless, and though deconstruction and Gödel are often discussed in the same sentence, and certainly there is overlap, I think Gödel and Hume were more similar than Gödel and Derrida. If deconstruction was called incompleteness, Hume might have been more eager to grab a seat. To suggest rationality should be deconstructed for being incomplete, in other words, for being itself, as opposed to being placed within its proper bounds and respected within those bounds, like Hume did, is to ironically suggest that autonomous rationality should be possible, and thus lurking in the background of deconstruction can be the same dream for autonomous rationality that inspired the very enlightenment which deconstruction constantly critiques. Deconstruction is an enemy of idealism, and yet its criticism of rationality seems justified in its mind by the failure of rationality to live up to an ideal. Perhaps Derrida himself did not make this mistake. I cannot claim to be a world expert on the thinker, but certainly many PD followers have so erred. There is a lack of reverence for rationality in PD, and though PD is justified in its Hume-like criticisms of bad philosophy, it, perhaps unintentionally, suggests all philosophy is bad philosophy, that there is no possibility of good philosophy like there is in Hume. Perhaps the PD would counter that they don't think all philosophy is corrupt, just most of it, but it certainly seems to be the case that the PD's starting assumption is that philosophy is guilty until proven innocent, especially if the philosophy attempts to make positive claims about the world as opposed to critique positive claims about the world. Hume was also skeptical of philosophy, but while PD suggests philosophy should be critiqued because it's worthy of scorn, Hume seemed to suggest philosophy needs to be critiqued because it's worth saving. Generally, I would say Hume's view of philosophy was more positive than PD, and his disposition and rationality against philosophy different. While Hume was dedicated to defining good philosophy from bad philosophy, PD is dedicated to unveiling that all philosophy hides mechanisms of control and power. Derrida wanted to pull back a curtain, while Hume wanted to weed a garden. Section 9. PD, perhaps unintentionally, suggests that it is possible to create a system that cannot be deconstructed, that systems shouldn't have to ultimately be founded on the unrational. For if systems are criticized on these grounds, it either suggests it's possible for systems to be formed otherwise, or that the practice of philosophy itself is fundamentally broken and should be entirely abandoned. PD seems to lead to either philosophical nihilism or philosophical idealism, both of which leave the world defenseless against bad philosophy and the tyranny it brings, because philosophy will always be with us, and if we do not believe philosophical skill is worth investing in, like secondhand smoke, we will still absorb the good and or bad philosophical ideas that come our way. Following Hume, recognizing that ultimately unrationality is at the root of systems shouldn't make us conclude that all systems are useless, but instead lead us to change our views on the possibility of autonomous rationality. To suggest, like deconstruction arguably does, that all structures of rationality are ultimately useless is to suggest that rationality has no role to play in human life, when Hume suggested good philosophy is extremely important. Certainly, Derrida himself may not have believed that rationality is insignificant, and PD thinkers like Deleuze certainly didn't, but unfortunately it seems to be a line of thought that has emerged out of the PD which Derrida was critical in birthing. Arguably, Derrida himself did not believe systems that can be deconstructed are systems that shouldn't be used at all, but I would venture to say that this is what most PD followers strongly suggest. They have often pushed deconstruction past the point of useful humility to the point of nihilism. But to be fair, many thinkers have done the same, misinterpreting Hume. Other PD thinkers aside, to give Derrida a charitable reading, let us assume he didn't believe autonomous rationality was possible and avoided any Enlightenment idealism lurking in the background of his thinking. Let us assume Derrida was identical in his views of rationality to Hume. Are there still meaningful differences? Rationality is indeed incomplete and must ultimately defer to natural beliefs, but does rationality deconstruct itself? Well, our reasoning and causality certainly can't be its own groundwork, for a necessary appearance of a firm foundation, as reason demands, never appears within rationality itself. And though Hume and Derrida understood this, and that something external to reason must ultimately be referenced, Hume and Derrida may have differed on the reliability of those external factors, and to the degree the new external factors don't fall into the same problems of incompleteness as did rationality. If there are real differences left, those differences might involve the degree to which Hume and Derrida believed external factors were useful in helping us render rationality more complete and or more useful. Derrida made it very clear that final justification is never present, but while Hume would have said within a rational system, Derrida may have added ever. For Hume, rationality must defer to experience, but if rationality does make this deference, our rationality stands upon a truth that there is reason to believe is strong. Deconstruction is not so sure, and it does seem to think that rationality stands strong even if it defers to common life, for according to Derrida, there is nothing outside the text. This is probably Derrida's most famous phrase. And it means that nothing is outside of interpretation and or endless networks of deferring, of a word being defined by words, which are defined by words, which are defined by words, difference, as Derrida called it. On books, Derrida believed there is no authorial presence outside the text, signified by an apprehended proper name, which can absolutely control the text's meaning, and Derrida carried this logic to God and objectivity in general. God is dead because there is no unique transcendent point from which one can judge conflicting interpretations, he claims. Consequently, Derrida would argue that common life itself must be interpreted and an expression of a likely privileged subjectivity, and consequently we cannot ascribe to a myth of authoritarian common life in the same way we cannot ascribe to the myth of an authoritative author. Derrida might have claimed that Hume's solution to the problem of rationality was a fake one, for as there can be no autonomous rationality, there could be no autonomous common life or truth. Hume thought common life could fill in the holes of incomplete rationality, but Derrida may have claimed Hume's solution to the problem was itself a problem. For Hume, common life as authority has authority, where Derrida may have stressed the impossibility of authority. That said, Derrida viewed his project as hopeful, for to him the death of God would ensure our salvation because the death of God alone can reawaken the divine. Derrida viewed authority as an ossifying force, something that brought discussion and creation to a standstill. For him, to say objectivity was impossible was to paradoxically free us to discover more truth. Likewise, Derrida believed the death of autonomous rationality would save rationality, as the death of complete philosophy would save philosophy. Hume would agree, but only if philosophy ultimately came to revere common life. There's certainly some truth to Derrida. Authority has often, throughout history, stifled growth, creation, and innovation. At the same time, although we might be more creative today, Hume might have pointed out that what people create is less able to bring stability and order to their lives, for it all feels increasingly arbitrary and non-authoritative. And in that unstable context, totalitarianism becomes appealing, as discussed in Belonging Again, and bad philosophy more difficult to stop from infiltrating hearts and minds. I do not believe Hume would be troubled by Derrida's claim that nothing is outside the text, for yes, we are forever stuck in subjectivity, interpretation, and uncertainty. But extensive tests through time, embodied in tradition and culture, give us reason to believe that the givens of tradition are more likely to be like what's best and true than all other possible foundations for philosophical systems. Verification is not possible, as we know from Popper, but givens are still necessary, which have arisen over decades of tests. So though not verified, we have reason to think that they haven't been falsified. Perhaps the tests were weak and did not try to falsify the givens hard enough, but there is no way for us to verify this, and so we are left with the choice of what will be our default orientation and assumption. Will we start our examination assuming common life is bad until it proves itself good, or will we start assuming common life is good until it proves itself bad? The PD seems to side with the more negative, believing he or she is justified considering historic examples of oppression, while the Humean would be more positive, believing he or she is justified considering historic examples of order and stability. Section 10. Both the Humean skeptic and PD understand that mathematical and empirical proofs are not the only game in town, that proving ideology is often like proving a land title, to use a point from Dr. William Wilson. We walk afield to see that the trees are where they are supposed to be, that the fences indeed border the streams, and so on. There is no guarantee of assent, and the proof is found in the walking out of the title, as discussed in Arguing Hume Through a Wedding Venue by O.G. Rose. The land title itself cannot provide the walk around the land. Action and experience are required to verify what the title says, because what the title says cannot verify itself, like a mathematical proof. There is no ideological system that can force assent in of itself, but if people ascribe to an epistemology that assumes the existence of a system that forces assent, they will have reason to deconstruct every actual system while feeling no responsibility to build something in its place, believing there is no need, for somewhere there must exist a system that will pass their standard like a discrete dream of Plato. After all, why would the epistemological standard exist if it only deconstructed everything? And why would the world act and teach as if scientific epistemology is the only epistemology necessary if it wasn't? It certainly feels like all we need. Both the Humean skeptic and PD understand that scientific and mathematical epistemologies are not enough, that autonomous rationality is impossible, and that ultimately the justification of a system must come down to experience and common life. Both thus stress the importance of community and identity in the formation of rationality, but for Hume, if we didn't take the whole deep and rigorous philosophical journey, any Humean skepticism we might ascribe to would be fragile. Based on ideas and not experiences, bad philosophy would likely eventually overcome our good philosophy. Perhaps we are not interested in philosophy and would prefer cultivating different skills. Understandable, but sounding like Trotsky, Hume might have warned that even if we are not interested in ideas, ideas are interested in us. That if we choose not to develop the abilities of a good philosopher, bad philosophy will still creep into our life. We will be fragile. Likewise, community without philosophy is fragile, But paradoxically, philosophy can also be a threat to community. Community without good philosophy is defenseless. But where there is good philosophy, there is philosophy, and so the possibility of bad philosophy that could uproot and undermine community. To live is to live with risk. To draw out another distinction between PD and Hume, what constitutes identity and community between the two seems very different. While PD stresses community based on race, gender, and class, to speak generally, Hume seemed to stress common life based on tradition, geography, and culture. This isn't to say PD thinkers don't believe that tradition shapes identity or that Hume didn't view race as a factor in the formation of common life, but it is to say that the two emphasize different dimensions of social and individual identity. This leads us to an important question. Are race, sex, and gender stronger ties and forces of formulation than, say, occupation, family, geography, and locality? Can what I'll call PD identity play the role of Hume's common life? Do not both form types of community? Are the two equally robust and capable of stopping the advances of bad philosophy? To start, we should ask, why has there been a shift from focus on Hume's common life to PD identity? Generally speaking, capitalism, globalization, and neoliberalism have uprooted people, forced them to move more, and ironed out local differences through corporations. The very neoliberalism that PD often critiques is a reason PD stresses characteristics of individual identity over geography, location, tradition, family, and the like, because race, sex, and gender can move between places, jobs, and families easily. While the characteristics of Hume's common life are much less mobile, fluid, and malleable, neoliberalism also praises and emphasizes individuality. And though race, gender, and sex place some restrictions on individuals, they are much more open to individual expression than community, tradition, and occupation. Neoliberalism seems to have influenced PD and what PD focuses on as a way to complete rationality, though it wouldn't follow from this necessarily that PD's identity is less robust than common life. However, not to say that it has, but if neoliberalism has removed the possibility of Hume's common life and replaced it with PD identity, neoliberalism may have removed the possibility of stopping the bad philosophy that helps neoliberalism spread. It is easier to identify the meaning of the phrase, I am a Virginian farmer, or the phrase, I am white. Is it? Which of these is easier to identify? Not to say it's easy to do either. A farmer is linked up clearly with certain activities and ways of life, while there doesn't seem to be a necessary way of life whiteness would lead a person to live. Yes, there are many kinds of farmers, Angus, dairy, vegetables, so on, but the horizon of possibility seems much more limited than for whiteness. Is being white just having white skin color? What is the meaning of white skin color? Who decides? By what standard? It also seems much easier to say positively what being a farmer means versus being white, as it would seem easier to describe what it means to be from Bedford versus a heterosexual. A heterosexual is someone who is sexually attracted to the opposite sex. But what is the meaning of being sexually attracted to the opposite sex? Someone from Bedford is someone who probably knows John Smith, who has visited the fair every spring and helped Ben with the square bales in the field by the river. People talk based on where they are from, have their weekends shaped by their surroundings, and have their friend circles shaped by people in their areas. When we meet someone, we often ask, where are you from? Before we ask, what does being white mean to you? We sense that a person's homeland has a profound influence on who they are. Does race, sex, and gender have an equally strong influence? Perhaps so. This has been part 4 of Deconstructing Common Life by O.G. Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Anchor, and thank you for your time.